Okay, we're going to do a video here, and I'm going to call this one, I guess, the beginning years. I'm going to go back in history. It'll be a little bit of my life experience and tying this into later into the racing years, riding years, and that of motocross, GNCC, and that. And just try and tie this all together from the very beginning. So some of the very beginning will be going way back in history, just to give a brief idea of how it even began and just the start of it all. So we'll go back here in history a little bit, and I'm going to take you to some other videos, or not videos, but photographs, and I'll tell the story up through. This here is here's my parents, Doris and Frank Spiegel. Beside them would be my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side, Bill and Jenny Fletcher. And on over, this here would be on my father's side, which was Frank and Madeline Spiegel. And we're going to go back even further, which this here would be my great-grandfather, Bill, great-grandpa Fletcher, and great-grandpa Fletcher. And this was at their house, which would be up where currently Fletcher's Arctic Cat is located. That house was there before Interstate 79 went up through this area, connecting Pittsburgh up through to Erie. That house was right under the one ramp area by the Arctic Cat dealership there. And when 79 went through, they had to take the house. And that has been demolished because of the rampway there to the interstate. And I'll tie this through how that's all is going to interconnect, because my great-grandparents owned land up through there. They owned a lot of the land here around Lake Wilhelm. Not a lot of it, but they owned farms and that around there. And that's where I would have grown up, and the development of this area also led to a lot of trail system and that for riding. Over here, this here would have been on my grandmother's side, great-grandma Tenesnik and great-grandpa Tenesnik. They lived right on up the road a little ways out. I believe that's Milledgeville Road. They had a small farm up there, which they come over from another country and settled over here in the United States. But that was their farm back then. My great-grandmother was still alive when I was born. I do remember her. And also my great-grandfather was alive at that time. So we'll transition on up through a little bit, and this here over here, this would have been from my great-grandmother, Tenesnik, my mom and her sister, and my grandmother. This was also on their farmland. I believe this one was probably up at my great-grandmother's, Tenesnik's. And here is also another picture of my mom and her sister. And here is a picture of my grandfather, Bill Fletcher. And this here would have been on the land. That's his tractor. He had the farm, where many people now would know the area by Vacation Land Campground here at Lake Wilhelm, and also Fergie's Bait Shop. Now that it's called Easy Does It Golf Carts there, and they just built a brand new bait shop. That is the land right where Fergie's Bait Shop is. The old building there was, my grandfather sold farm equipment and had a welding shop. That later became the bait shop there, which was Fergie's Bait. When they sold the house, the old house was there till, maybe within the last 10 years they tore down the house, and his original building was there where Fergie's Bait is. All the bait shop and all that was developed when Lake Wilhelm was built and went in, which brought many changes to the area. So this gives you a little bit of the history then of the land around here and how I connected into the later years. So then fast forward a little bit, it would have been in the late 60s. The state come through and they decided they were going to build a lake, which is known as Maurice K. Goddard State Park. A lot of people know it also as Lake Wilhelm. When they come through, by eminent domain, they claimed a lot of the farmland from clear up here where I lived, which would have been towards the very upper, higher end of the lake, to clear down to Sandy Lake. They claimed all along the creek that run down through there. They took a total of 2,856 acres of land that they claimed. Most of it was farmland. The lake then they began construction in the late 60s, and they completed the dam in 1971. It was completed. And in 1972, they opened Lake Wilhelm to the public. So my parents had just built a brand new house a few years prior to the land being claimed. And when the state come through and was claiming the land, at first they told my parents they weren't going to take their place because they were on the very outer border of the property of where the lake was coming. And then later they come back and told them that they were taking it. And it ended up, they took it. It was a brand new house. They wanted it for the park superintendent. So that's why their place was taken. Then that became the park superintendent's house, and still is yet today, for where he lives for the state park for Lake Wilhelm. There's been several different park superintendents over the years, but so anyway, they took their property, and right where their property, the property they took, must have been the highest elevation. So they also decided they put up a water tower on this property. And from that water tower then, all along the lake, which spans probably from the central part, there's a lot in the upper area where no motors are allowed, but the lower part, from basically the marina on down, is probably about 12 miles, and they took all that land down through there. So there was about a 12-mile area, maybe even 13 areas, from where they built the water tower on my parents' property that they took. And they were going to, during construction, they had to connect the water lines. This water tower was going to supply the water for the marina, all the boat launches clear down to the dam. So they come through and they excavated a narrow path down through the woods, winding path the whole way down through those 12 or 13 miles. Now this next picture would be, so my parents had to move out, and they built another new house in right, almost not quite directly, just down several hundred feet and on the opposite side of the road. Built a house because they had to move out, and this, then as you can see clear down in the background over the pickup there, that is where later Fergie's bait shop was, which was my great-grandparents' land. They moved in the field next between my parents and the bait shop, but it hasn't been put in there yet, where they moved into up there. Now, how that pipeline becomes of great importance in the riding part around here is we lived right on the school district property line, which myself and my brother and that went to Commodore Perry School District, which would have been on towards the upper part of the lake. And probably about a half mile down the road was the border line for Lakeview School District. So as kids, we knew everybody from just starting into school and that. You knew the kids right in your very local neighborhood and from Commodore Perry School District. But the kids that lived relatively close, but they went to a totally different school district. So somewhere after they bought this property here, built it here, me and my brother got, these here had to be probably around the year, I'm going to say very late 60s, very beginning of 70, somewhere in there. And I'm just estimating some of these dates due to when the dam was built and when we moved over there. So I know that if it opened, and they were doing construction in 71, we had moved over there prior to that because they had already taken the property. So it had to be somewhere late 60s, early 70s. my parents bought me and my brother a little mini bikes. These here had 3.5 horsepower Briggs & Stratton engines on them, had a pull rope for a pull starter and the centrifugal clutch. And that was our very first bikes as far as motorbikes or mini bikes. And it would have been on this property here. We had little paths beat up and down the yard where we rode them mini bikes all the time. We rode them a lot. No suspension, hard frames, and the frames would break. My grandfather had his weld shop, so he would weld up the frames for us. Actually, I had the handlebars break clear off of mine one time going down across the field. They just snapped right off, and that was typical for them. It was just a hard tubing frame, no suspension or anything, but we rode the mini bikes a lot. Then a few years later, it would have been probably around 1972, we got a little Yamaha 60. Bought them from Street Track and Trail. Myself and my brother got one. And just prior to that, when we were looking around, there used to be an Indian dealership right in Greenville, and we were looking at them and really liked them. So I'm not quite sure how we transitioned and went to the Yamahas. Kind of glad we did now, because Indians have been long gone as far as I know. But we got these little Yamaha 60s. And at that time, all the kids in the neighborhood we rode bicycles and that. You can see all the different neighborhood kids there. There would have been Tim Marsteller in the background of that picture. Donnie Clark, who was holding the slingshot there, pretty young at that age. Myself, my brother, and the next photo over would have been Richter's. They were a couple kids that moved into the neighborhood. I believe they maybe lived over by Cleveland, not sure, but they lived up behind us. Also went to Commodore Perry School District. My cousin Doreen Clark. So there would have been Jeff Richter, Harry Richter, Ed Richter. Don't think Mike was in the picture. Maybe myself and my brother. But we got these little Yamaha 60s. So at that time, the land around here, and it was very undeveloped. You could ride anywhere. I mean, literally there was trails that ran from our parents' house right here by Fergie's, and we rode in the fields and that. But there was trails connected you to a lot of the roads around here were dirt roads, and so you could ride on the dirt roads. There was some blacktop roads, but a lot of the back roads were all still dirt roads. A lot of them are still yet today, just dirt roads. So we could ride our bikes on the dirt roads. And that water tower they built across the road there on my parents' land that they took ran then clear to Sandy Lake, which crossed into school districts. Well, as kids, we soon to realize, hey, that made a great trail, because it was all dirt yet, been excavated to build that pipeline down through there. So we started jumping on that and riding that trail, which connected us to all the kids in Lakeview School District, because there was a lot of kids lived down that way, also had motorcycles, which they discovered that pipeline as well. So that pipeline kind of become the interconnecting highway for kids around this area all along Lake Wilhelm. And we would ride that, and when you're out there riding, you would run into these other kids. There was a farm clear down the road there that's where we met, ran into Marstellers, which later become really good friends with myself and Clay Marsteller. Clay had a friend, Dave Clausen, which Dave later then become a real good friend of mine. Me and Dave and Clay used to travel quite a little bit in the later years when we started racing motocross and that. Primarily me and Dave traveled a lot together. Dave was a little bit older. I was pretty young at the time when I started racing, so I would travel with Dave. And but Clay was also involved, went along. Also his cousins Butch and Tim Marsteller. And later, also, I guess when I was around 16, we were racing, and also met up with another really good friend of mine, John Gallagher, who also lived down there. But we would all ride the pipeline. Don Harry down that way, just a lot of other kids from this area that we had met from that pipeline. And everybody was into riding mini bikes and motorcycles, and all along that pipeline there was just literally trails that went everywhere. And they were endless. You could ride and ride and ride, and that's how it was around here. The trails systems, gravel pits. There was a lot of gravel pits around that we would ride into these gravel pits, and then you could climb hills, lay out tracks and ride the tracks and that around there. But there was some big gravel pits. This one here would have been down by Hadley, which is probably took in several hundred acres. But it was all open for riding. You can see the trails that just went everywhere through these gravel pits. And again, back at that time, nobody cared. You could just ride. Here's another gravel pit. I believe that was down by Sandy Lake. This one here was down below the dam along Wilhelm. But there was just literally trails everywhere, and that pipeline kind of interconnected us all through there. Just as a little note there, that was probably in the very early 70s, holding up a motocross magazine. We used to go to Greenville, because at that time you had no internet, no nothing, but there was called the News Depot in there, and they sold magazines. And we were just, motorcycles become everything back then to all the kids in that. And so we started to pick up these magazines once in a while, and you were starting to see, it was called motocross. And at that time it was Roger DeCoster. He was the man. He was one of the main riders, and he was from, I believe he was from Europe, is where he grew up, somewhere over there. Later he come to the US, and ironically I've ran across him and got to meet him at High Point Raceway. It was some years later, but this would have been me probably in the early 70s, holding up a magazine which had his picture in it. Now, at that point in time, I'll give you a little bit of history here of with motocross. Motocross was not in the United States it come over here somewhere in the 1960s. It was very popular over in Europe in 1940, 1950s. It was pretty popular over there, but it never come to the United States until in the 1960s. I'm going to say probably mid-60s, somewhere in there. So the very beginnings of our riding was right when motocross was just coming into this country. Over here, nobody even knew who it was, really. And it was a far cry different from what it is today. So I was given that just to give a little bit of how the land and a lot of like I said, the farmland that my grandparents owned and that, which later become developed around the lake, which then led to the water tower and the pipeline being built. Interconnected then to all the riding, you know, how we rode the different trails and connected with the different friends that we made lifelong friends then with over the years. I'm going to transition back over. And this here would be the very beginnings of racing motocross. These pictures were probably taken, I'm going to estimate, that was probably from the very first, I'm pretty certain, the very first motocross race that we ever went to. So I'll back up and tell the story a little bit of how that come about. So again, back with the pipeline, riding that, and I had a cousin who lived right down the road from us, probably about 1.5 miles down. Also went to Lakeview School District, and that pipeline connected right behind his house. So again, we'd be riding our mini bikes down there. Cousin Kip Ray, not sure how he found out about motocross, or even racing in that, but he did. And him and his dad had went to a few races, and so Kip was starting to race, and he had at that time, he had a Yamaha 175. It was an enduro. In the very beginning years of racing in that, everybody just brought whatever they had. A lot of the bikes were just old enduros where they stripped the headlights, taillights, turn signals, and the majority of people just had paper plates were tied onto the side of your motorcycle, and you took black electrical tape and made numbers on them. That was the majority of the bikes. The racing gear was, a lot of people wore just engineer boots or the old ring boots like that, because you didn't have actual motocross boots. You wore whatever you had for a shirt. You had helmets. Not everybody even wore gloves. Maybe a crude pair of glasses for goggles. And that's just the beginning years of motocross in this country. So anyway, Kip started to go to a few races, and again, he was my cousin, so we would talk to him and be down there at different times and that, and riding. And so he was went to a track. It was called Freedom Acres. Freedom Acres was down off of Route 8, going between, say, Sandy Lake, heading towards, go down through Slippery Rock, down to Route 8, and then you're heading towards Butler, PA. But there was an old strip mine area down there where they built a motocross track. Not sure who owned it, run it, or anything, but there was a motocross track down there. And at that time, motocross was catching on really fast here in the United States. So they were getting really good turnouts down there. I mean, the classes at that time, most of your classes probably had at least 30 bikes in a class, if not more. And that was at the very beginnings. The classes at that time, you had mini, 100 class, a 175 class, then they had the 250, and an open class. They might have had I'm guessing they probably had then another class called expert class for the upper level riders, and that primarily on the bigger bikes. You didn't have all the classes with all the different age groups and that, and you didn't have your A, B, and C classes so much back then. It was just the basic classes, but you had a lot of bikes in them, probably because they were all combined together. So anyway, we went down there to watch Kip race, and this again was just an old strip mine where they laid out. It was a fairly long track, probably close to a mile long maybe, throughout this strip mine area, up and down some really steep hills, really dusty down in the bottom areas, and that they had no water trucks, no watering system. That was back during the rubber band start time too, where they would draw a rubber band across, and then the bikes would all line up behind it, and they'd snap the rubber band and let them go. So we went down and watched Kip race, and somewhere, I believe it was that following week, my brother said, "I think I'm going to try racing." And I remember telling him, "You're crazy, you're going to get killed." It just looked extremely dangerous, even at that time. It looked very fast, especially that first corner, all the bikes plowing into it. I just thought it looked really dangerous. But being young, and I don't know what changed my mind, in the middle of that week I decided, well, I'm going to race too. So, and then another friend of ours, Butch Marsteller, which he lived on a farm down the road, he decided, and we all hung out and rode together in that, decided he was going to race too. So the pictures you're looking here, the one on the left, that would have been my parents', it was a 1974 Ford pickup with the cap on it. And the three motorcycles there was mine there at the very back of the pickup, which was Tim Marsteller holding it. Myself and my mother standing there. My brother's Enduro, Yamaha 175, and that would have been Butch's CZ250, which CZs were fairly popular back then. Anyway, we loaded all three of them in the back of the pickup. Myself, my brother, Tim, and Butch probably rode in the back of the pickup in the cab. And my mother and father up in the front drove us to a track. I believe the name of it was called J&D Motocross Park. It was up by Erie, Waterford area, somewhere up in there. It was a farm, fairly decent track, got really big turnouts up there. So we all went up there to that motocross race, and at that time, again, this here would have been, by this period of time was 1974, because that was my 1974 MX100. Went up there, just probably the second race I had ever been to in my life. The first one was to spectate. This one here is actually going to race. There's a big old barn there. That was the sign-up area. We went in there. But the AMA was actually around back then, even in the very beginning years and starting. So I signed up. You had to join the AMA and you had to be a member to be able to. It was a sanctioned race to be able to race. So I signed up. My brother signed up and Butch signed up. The three of us signed up right together, one after another. And at that time you used the last three digits of your AMA number become your race number. That's what you used. So my number, that's how we were, I believe Butch was probably, I'm not sure, mine was 109. I think my brother's number was 108 and Butch's was probably 107. So all three of our numbers were like concurrent right together because we all joined the AMA at that time. So I'd still have my AMA card from the very beginning years there. So that was the very beginning years of the racing, how it come about and the formation of how we joined up through the pipeline and how that all tied together. Over the years, again, a lot of our friends, and some of them being Clay Marsteller, Dave Clausen, John Gallagher, all raced. John raced for quite a few years. John was a little bit younger than us, and it's developed from that, and it was really the pipeline that joined us all along that lake. There's many other friends that also rode. Some of them didn't race in that, but had mini bikes. And so I'm kind of fast forwarding here a little bit when I'm getting into the racing because I wanted to make this video because I knew it'd probably be fairly long. So I wanted to break it into sections, like the very beginning years up to the start of racing and then up through the racing years and that, how that all developed and come about. But I wanted to give this here, it gives a little bit of the history, how we were around in the very beginning, when motocross was very first coming to this country. And tie it all together from that. So I'll try to keep this video just a little bit shorter. We'll call it the beginning years. And hopefully this helps give an understanding of how we even got into the racing in the beginning, how it come about. And I also guess I'll make a note of like all the kids around here when they rode in the riding areas, everybody built tracks in at their property. So when we rode that pipeline and you would go off of that pipeline, like my cousin Kip, he had a circle track down in the back. This was now on state park property, but again, you could ride everywhere. Nobody really bothered you. Park patrol, a little bit would. They didn't want you really riding the pipeline, but they didn't really bother you. They understood it was just kids riding it, so they didn't bother you a whole lot. And it was, again, like our main connector, but then you'd go to Johnny Gallagher's, and he had a track at his place. Marsteller's, Clay Marsteller, which then Clay later started called Lakeside Cycles. It was a Boataka dealership, and later he took on Can-Am, so he owned then, pretty young age, really, but we were all young, but this here would have been probably Clay at that time was probably just graduated high school, to give you an idea of age-wise, when he started Lakeside Cycles, Boataka dealership, Can-Am dealership, And the supercross track on their property, two of them, very crude ones, built in the, one was in the horse arena thing. So, and outdoor tracks, we all went together and had a large outdoor track built, which I guess I'll go back to making a note too of. That would have been my mother's uncle, would have been my grandfather's brother, Tom Fletcher. Also owned Fletcher's Arctic Cat, which you've seen in the one picture back to my great-grandfather that owned the land there where 79 went through. That this is all property in the same area. And anyway, Tom Fletcher owned an excavating and trucking business. So, and actually the very large pond, which was a gravel pit at that time, at my uncle's property there, or my mother's uncle, right by the Arctic Cat dealership up on that property, that there is where, when they were building Lake Wilhelm, they put the upper and lower causeway through. And that gravel pit is actually where a lot of the gravel come from to build the causeways, the upper and lower causeway for Lake Wilhelm. When the construction of it was being built, was, since that property was right there, I'm not sure how that come about, whether Tom did the trucking and excavating of that gravel pit or whether he just sold it to the state and they did it with their construction crews. Not sure of that, but he also had an excavating business, so he very well may have done the excavating and trucking, because he had a trucking business at that time also with the dump trailers and that. They primarily hauled coal, but so that's how that gravel pit come about, which we would ride in there, and then later they turned that into a very large pond, or he did. But we would ride up there and around the pond, and from our place, right up the road, we could ride trails down to my uncle's there. And he had, at the trucking garage, he had a place where they repaired the semis and that and parked them, but there was also fuel pumps there. There was a gas pump there. So this will just give a little bit of history here of, as far as gas prices. At that time, we would ride our little 60s, Yamaha 60s, up to Tom's garage, and he had an old cigar box in the garage with money in it and change, because there wasn't always somebody there, but we could ride up and we knew where to turn on the gas pump, pump our own gas into our bikes and fill up there, and then you would just pay and leave the money in the cigar box. And at that time, gas was 35 cents a gallon. That's the first I remember buying gas, was back then, and that would have been probably around 1972, 1973. 35 cents a gallon for gasoline. And that was everywhere around here. That wasn't just because he was my great uncle or whatever there. It was just, that's what it was selling for, and we just paid what everybody else did, because others could stop there and get gas as well. So that gives some of the history in that. I'm trying to think of other things to cover. So we covered with Kip Ray, how we got started into it, how we got to know. I'll give another unique little story. In the very beginning on the pipeline, the very first time I ever met Clay Marsteller, was I already knew Kip since he was my cousin. And we were going down there. I don't know who was along, but we were riding down the pipeline headed towards Sandy Lake. And this must have been some months after the excavation was already completed, so our trail was heavily beaten, so it was a dirt path. But the weeds had already begun to grow up along the sides of it into taller grass. And every so far down the pipeline, they put a steel marker stake. It was about a 3-inch steel pipe sticking up out of the ground, and that marked or designated exactly where the pipe was below the ground. So we're riding the pipeline. It was just below Kip's place, headed towards Sandy Lake. And Kip and Clay were coming back up the pipeline. I believe Clay was on maybe a 175 Enduro or something. And Clay pulled out, got off the beaten path, swung out in the high grass to make a pass down through there, I think on Kip, coming up through there. and not sure how fast he was going, but I know they were clipping along pretty fast, and didn't see one of them steel marker pipes there sticking up in the high grass, and Clay hit the thing directly straight on with the front wheel into that pipe. And it had just happened when we come along, and Clay's forks on the bike, both forks were bent and pushed the tire clear back into the exhaust, bending both front forks. He had hit that pipe that hard. And the front of the bike was kind of mangled up in that. And prior to doing that, I guess kids used to find some alcohol at times. It was just what kids did back then. Well, they had been drinking some prior to riding back up there and hitting that pipe. And so anyway, they had to go down there. I remember taking a tie-down strap and tying it on to Clay's bike, and we drug it back up through to Kip's house. It was only maybe a half-mile back, and pulled in there, and my mother's cousin, Janet North, was there. And she detected they had been drinking, and I remember she was kind of reading the riot act to them about this. And that's kind of my first memories of ever meeting Clay, was right there on the pipeline when he hit that marker pipe, and how Janet had been reaming them out then. I don't believe they were totally drunk, but they had been drinking some down there. They probably rode their bikes down and had been drinking a little bit, and on the way back that happened. So just a little side note story there on that one there. And I guess I'll also mention the pipeline today has now become the trail system around Lake Wilhelm. They built a bicycle trail where they paved it all. But in the beginning years, that bike trail was actually just our dirt pipeline, and when we would ride that, nobody had any money back then. Everybody just rode their bikes till they did whatever they had to do to keep them running. Kids were pretty creative. And that pipeline could be a real challenge, because you went right down, whatever the bank was, you went down the bank or down the hill, right into a creek or swamp, through it, and back up the other side, which was climbing back up out of the creeks. And there were certain areas then that it would take us a while to get through, because we would all get to there and nobody could make it up the bank, so all the kids were off pulling each other, trying to get the bikes up out of the creeks and that, and back up the banks. Most of us had bald tires on the bikes. And I really wish I had a picture of this bike, but it would have been Butch and Tim Marsteller's. They had an old Honda 90. And at that time, the Honda 90s were built sort of like a girl's bicycle where you stepped through. And the gas tank was actually the seat. It had a little flip-up seat. You flipped the seat up. The lid was under the seat. And that was your seat and gas tank. Anyway, they lived on a farm. They had no money, and this was the bike the two of them shared at the time to ride. Sometimes they would ride doubles. Had a little metal luggage rack thing on the back of this Honda 90. And this bike had been ridden so much, the front and back tires were the exact same size rim. So when the back tire got totally bald, literally it was like a slick, just smooth rubber. They moved it to the front and put the front tire on the back. Well, eventually that tire also. So now you had a bald slick on the front and back of that bike. The shift lever had broke off or stripped, or something happened there. So they had a pair of vice grips snapped onto the shift shaft out of the motor. Was a pair of vice grips that stuck out of there. So to downshift, you would step down on the vice grips. Into upshift, there was a piece of baler twine tied to the vice grips back up to the handlebars. You would have to grab the baler twine and pull up on it to upshift, and downshift, you'd step down on the vice grips. The exhaust pipe had got all bent in and everything, so they cut it off. The pipe came out of the motor at the front, did a bend back, which it was probably about a 1-inch diameter pipe on that little 90 at that time, bent back, and the exhaust from their back got destroyed. So there was an old piece of water pipe, steel water pipe, just a straight pipe. They shoved over that exhaust on the front, and it was tied with some old fence wire to the luggage rack in the back, so that was the exhaust. You'd have to watch you didn't burn your leg on the exhaust. The bike was louder than heck. Just had a water pipe stuck back across. The seat, not sure what happened to the seat, but it was gone. So they had this old orange smiley face pillow with a couple bungee straps that went over the pillow to hold it on. That was the seat. It was this orange smiley face pillow. And the thing burnt so much oil, they would keep old motor oil from the farm, apparently when their dad changed oil in the tractors or something, but they had a couple plastic quarts of oil, old oil cans. They would put oil in and strap them on the luggage thing on the back so they could just continue to dump old motor oil in the motor to keep it running. The levers on the front, not sure where the bolts went out of them, but they had old nails pulled out of the old lumber, because you didn't even have new nails back then. It was just old bent nails people commonly would use for building stuff. They put the nails down through as the bolts and bent them over so they wouldn't come back up out. And like I said, back then, kids just got really creative to keep their bikes running. They did whatever they had to do it. That motor on their 90 had blown up several times. There's an old house there. We'd go in there, and that was sort of their little workshop for at the farm. But the fathers didn't do it for you back then. You had to figure it out on your own. They would have to tear down their own motors, rebuild them, and which we did the same. My father was always the same way. Once we got bikes, he never really worked on them. It was always up to you. It was left up to you to figure out how to work on them. I remember we bought a metric socket set, or I did. That would come from Street Track and Trail, an SK socket set. Still got it today. Because the bikes were metric, we didn't have metric tools. But whenever anything needed, sprockets needed changed or whatever, you figured it out on your own how to do it. Down to changing the oil in the motors, to later into rebuilding the motors. First time I ever changed the fork oil, I believe it was on my little 60 maybe. Might have been at the 100 at that time. Had no idea about changing oil. I took the caps off the top of the forks, turned the bike over, poured all the oil out, took them, poured oil back in, it was probably motor oil, filled them clear to the top, thinking I'm putting new oil in, put the caps back on, got on the bike, and the forks wouldn't move. They were stiff as a rock because I filled them to the very top with oil. So, solution, take the caps off, push down on the forks till some of the oil flows over the top, put the caps back in, and there you go. That's how you rode them. But that's how it was back then. I mean, you did whatever, figured it out on your own. The Phillips head screws, a lot of the case screws used to be Phillips head, because at times we'd have to pull off clutch covers, different things like that. And for a kid, you couldn't hardly push hard enough on the screwdriver to get them screws out. They were tight. So, and again, our fathers didn't do it. We had to do it ourselves. So then we bought a impact driver. It was just like a screwdriver you held, and you would hit it with a hammer, and when you hit it with the hammer, the bit would turn. It would make the bit rotate. So it was the impact of the hammer putting the pressure in and making that bit rotate. So we got one of them, and that's how we would get them Phillips screws out. But the Phillips screws and motor screws and that would be so stripped on them engines that from doing that over the different times, most of the bolts in that were stripped. A lot of time we didn't have wrenches in that. A lot of times we had to use pliers to take stuff apart. But that was what it was like in the very early 70s in that and riding. So that just gives you some of the unique stories from back then, the very beginning years, and I'll be concluding this one pretty shortly. And I'll pick up, the next one will probably be the very beginning of the racing years. Do that as a separate video. So I will conclude this one now.